get the definitions and the measurements right, because systems optimize to maximize their score on what they're measured by. And I suppose living to 140 wouldn't be so good if you were senile for the last 70 years and institutionalized, for example. And so it sounds like when you talk about health span, you're intermingling two quality of life issues. One would be the expansion of youth rather than longevity per se, and then something associated with that existential quality of life. So maybe we could start with, well, does that seem to capture, the interaction of those two things seem to capture what you're talking about with regard to health span?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the cognitive and physical piece are the pieces that do decline with age, and we want to preserve those as long as possible. And we can be very specific about what those things are, by the way, right? We could drill into what is cognitive health span, what is physical health span. And then that other one that is not so age dependent might be at least as important, and probably frankly falls much more into your wheelhouse than mine, professionally at least, and that is about the quality of a person's life and the quality of their relationships, their sense of purpose, and things of that nature.
The content I've created over the past year represents some of my best to date, as I've undertaken additional extensive exploration in today's most challenging topics and experienced a nice increment in production quality, courtesy of Daily Wire Plus. We all want you to benefit from the knowledge gained throughout this adventurous journey. I'm pleased to let you know that for a limited time, you're invited to access all my content with a 7-day free trial at Daily Wire Plus. This will provide you with full access to my new in-depth series on marriage, as well as guidance for creating a life vision, and my series exploring the book of Exodus. You'll also find there the complete library of all my podcasts and lectures. I have a plethora of new content in development that will be coming soon exclusively on Daily Wire Plus. Voices of reason and resistance are few and far between these strange days. Click on the link below if you want to learn more. And thank you for watching and listening. Yeah, so a long while back, I was looking at interventions to improve people's lives. And I knew at that point that cognitive decline was a major problem, especially in terms of productivity and general competence. So it's a pretty pronounced linear downhill trend on the fluid intelligence front from about the age of 25 forward. That can decline precipitously in, say, late 70s, early 80s, especially with the onset of degenerative neurological diseases. And I was looking at the literature on cognitive remediation. This is back in the times, 10, 15 years ago, when there were a lot of online sites that purported to run you through cognitive exercises that could increase or maintain your IQ. There's never been any evidence for that, by the way. It's a pretty damn dismal literature. But what I did find, and I think this is extremely solid, is that if you want to maintain your cognitive function, that both cardiovascular exercise and weightlifting seem to do a pretty damn good job. And maybe that's because the brain is such an oxygen-demanding organ, and other, obviously, it's energy-demanding and resource-demanding in other ways. And if you can keep yourself cardiovascularly fit, interestingly enough, that's the best pathway to cognitive health. Then I was looking on the psychological side, and what I found was that there were interventions that help people get their story straight. Psychotherapy is one of those, but there are written interventions. If people write about their past traumas, and if they write about their future plans, they reduce general uncertainty, that reduces their stress, and that seems to produce a relatively pronounced physiological benefit. And so there's an interesting interplay there that we can talk about more in terms of the emotional and the physical. It's pretty funny that if you want to improve your cognitive function or maintain it, you should exercise rather than think. And that if you want to improve your physiology, you should straighten out your story and face your traumas rather than, say, exercise. So what do you recommend in your book, in Outlive in particular, with regard to the expansion of health span? What do you think, and how do you practice this personally? What do you recommend? recommend to people?
So I think that exercise is empirically the most valuable tool we have for both the cognitive and physical components. So let's start with the cognitive, because I think here it was less intuitive. So about 10 years ago, when I really went down this rabbit hole, I had one of my research analysts spend a lot of time going through the literature. So we created a framework where we were going to look at every single intervention and how it impacted executive function, processing speed, short-term memory, long-term memory. Those were the 4 metrics we cared about, because as you point out, those are all bits of intelligence that decline with age. So, we looked at everything. Okay, so we looked at every molecule, we looked at every possible thing that you could think of. And after about 9 months of this, the thing that stood out above all else, beyond any diet, beyond the importance of sleep, and other things that certainly matter, controlling blood pressure, lipids, etc., was exercise. And I, even though I was a lifelong exerciser and loved to exercise, I just couldn't believe it. It seemed so trite that exercise could have such a profound difference on the state of cognition, not just in terms of its performance as effectively a nootropic, but also in its ability to delay, if not outright prevent, dementia. So once we dug into the mechanisms, I think it became clear why exercise is so potent. And it's basically that it is acting on so many different levels. So as you pointed out, it's acting at a metabolic level. The brain is such an energy demanding organ. As you know, and maybe your listeners do, it weighs about 2% of your body weight, and it's responsible for 20 to 25% of your energy consumption. So therefore, anything that disrupts that is catastrophic. So when you look at the improvements in glucose, insulin sensitivity, all metabolic parameters, exercise is the most important tool we have there. When you look at the reduction of inflammation, vascular health improvements, again, exercise stands alone. When you look at the production of neurotrophic growth factors such as BDNF, again, exercise is basically a drug for neurons. And so I think I eventually came around after a year or so to realize that, again, as simple as it sounds, exercise is such a potent tool. And you look at the brains of people who exercise a lot, and you can see far less damage, not just microvascularly, but in terms of brain volume loss over time.
Whether you're feeling stressed, anxious, or simply seeking a moment of peace and tranquility, the Hallow app has something for you. Hallow offers an incredible range of guided meditations and prayers that are designed to help you deepen your spirituality and strengthen your connection to God. With Hallow, you can explore different themes and types of prayer and meditation, such as gratitude, forgiveness, and centering prayer. You can also choose from different lengths of meditation to fit your schedule, whether you have a few minutes or an hour. With its user-friendly interface and hundreds of guided meditations, the Hallow app has quickly become a go-to resource for people seeking spiritual growth and healing. Download the app for free at hallow.com/Jordon. You can set prayer reminders and track your progress along the way. Hallow is truly transformative and will help you connect with your faith on a deeper level. So what are you waiting for? Download the Hallow app today at hallow.com/Jordon. That's hallow.com/Jordon. Once again, it's hallow.com/Jordon for an exclusive 3-month free trial of all 6,000 plus prayers and meditations.
So let's talk about exercise from the perspective of a behavioral psychologist. So one of the things you learn as a behavioral psychologist is that it's very difficult for people to change their attitudes or their actions. It's very difficult for people to change their lives. And we all know this because we might tell ourselves, for example, to exercise, and we might be well supplied with arguments for why that's a good idea, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we learn how to incorporate an exercise routine into our life. And often the reason for that, there's many reasons. Exercise is difficult, and that's one reason, but it's also often the case that people don't form a strategy and break the problem down into steps that are simple enough to actually implement. So they think things like, well, I'll go to the gym 2 hours a day, 3 times a week, and I'll start that next week. And the truth of the matter is they don't have 6 hours to spend, and they can't tell themselves what to do anyways. And so what you do as a behavioral psychologist is you look at the simplest possible change that produces the maximum possible benefit. And so, for example, if people are listening and they want to begin to implement an exercise routine, like what about a daily walk of 10 minutes in the morning? Like where would you start someone?
So it completely depends on their baseline, but based on your question, Jordan, I'm going to take it as we're talking about someone who's doing no exercise.
Yeah, let's start with them.
Yeah, so the good news is, first of all, and I accept the fact that not everybody is swayed by data, but I at least want to put it out there. So if you're a person who's in the doing 0 exercise per week camp, the very good news is the benefit you get from going from 0 to 3 hours a week is a greater benefit than anyone gets on the exercise program. Right? So taking someone who's at 5 hours and taking them to 15 will produce less relative benefit than going from 0 to 3 hours. So in other words, I want that person to see some real incentive for making this change. Secondly, I've got some numbers to you. So going from no exercise to 3 hours a week approximately reduces your cost. Your all-cost mortality, that is to say death of every cause, by 50% right on the number. So if you're standing there asking, what's the probability I'm going to die this year? Well, we can sort of actuarially figure that out. You get to cut that number in half by simply going from 0 to 3 hours exercise a week if you're a non-exerciser. So again, there's going to be a subset of people for whom that's a very powerful piece of information they didn't know. So then what I would say was, how do you do that? So I agree with you that you're much better off trying to do 30 minutes 6 times a week than 3 hours once a day, or 2 hours, in whatever fashion. So what I would say is the most effective way to do that is probably about 90 minutes of low intensity cardio. And for a person who's not particularly fit, that's going to amount to just brisk walking. Rather than tell them what to do, I tell them how to feel when they're doing it. So what you want to feel is out of breath enough that you can barely carry out a conversation, but you could if you had to, but not so out of breath that you can't carry on a conversation, and not so easy that you can speak easily. So there's that sweet spot in there. Physiologically, we call that zone 2, but I'm not going to bore them with that nomenclature. It's just basically 90 minutes, say 3 times 30 or 2 times 45 a week, where you're just out of breath enough that you don't want to talk, but you could if you had to. That's part 1.
Right. So you push yourself slightly past your simple level of comfort.
That's right.
And so let me push on you a bit with regards to 3 hours a week. Again, from perspective of taking someone from 0 to somewhere. What are the benefits? Let's say you talked about the benefits of walking something approximating 20 to 25 minutes a day. That can be dispersed out in various ways. You also mentioned like 2 45-minute sessions or 3 30-minute sessions. What would happen if someone goes from 0 to like 10 minutes a day or an hour a week? Where do the benefits of that 3 hours?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think we have the fidelity of the data at that level because you generally don't push enough of a conditioning benefit. But I think what you're getting at, and we do this as well, is you want to separate between the behavior change and the physiologic change. And for some people, and James Clear has written a lot about this, but I think a lot of people have come to the same conclusion with any behavior change. If it's a person who's never done anything, you're right. The answer might be for every day when you wake up in the morning, rather than your normal routine of jumping in front of the computer, I want you to go and walk around the block once. It'll take 4 minutes. And so I don't want to represent you're going to get a physiologic benefit from that. You probably won't. But what you will get is you're going to start to reset a behavior, which is, the first thing I do in the morning now is this other thing. And we'll slowly increase that, and at some point, you will get a physiologic benefit. But what we're doing is planting the seed of how to change the behavior.
Yeah, well, you can always expand that over a year. I mean, another thing I learned as a behavioral therapist, and this seems obvious, but it's not obvious enough so that people think about it or put it into practice, is that your life is made up of the very small number of things that you repeat every day. And these are often things that people consider trivial. So, for example, lots of people sit down have dinner with their family every evening, and they don't consider that special. But because you do it every damn day for an hour and a half, it's like 8% of your life. So you only have to get 15 of those things in order, and you have your whole life in order. Same thing applies to a daily habit. And so if you started, say, walking for 10 minutes a day, well, that's 70 minutes a week, and that's 4 hours a month, or 50 hours, or 1 work week a year. And that's a substantive change. That's about 2% of your life, your waking life, something like that, or at least 2% of your awake working life. And so it's useful for everyone listening to understand that small changes that you maintain can be of radical importance. And once you're walking for 10 minutes a day, it's a hell of a lot easier to go to, say, 12 minutes than it is to go from 0 to walking at all. So, yeah. So, okay. So what do you think, what did you conclude as a consequence of going through the literature with regards to, say, weightlifting rather than cardiovascular exercise?
So in biology, we look to integral functions to give us a sense of how valuable an input is, and you don't get many of them, okay? So most people are probably familiar with something called a hemoglobin A1C. It's a blood test you get at the doctor, and if it's high enough, it tells you if you have type 2 diabetes. So if the hemoglobin A1C is beyond 6.5%, that tells you that over the past 3 months, your average blood glucose has been 140 milligrams per deciliter, which is the cutoff for type 2 diabetes. So in that sense, hemoglobin A1C is an integral of your behavior over the past 3 months with respect to glucose. We don't have a lot of those, but we have 2 really amazing ones with respect to exercise. One of them is around strength and muscle mass, and one of them is around peak cardiorespiratory fitness. With respect to, so I'll just get to the punchline. The punchline is there is no metric that is more highly associated with living a long life. Just this is purely based on length of life. There's no metric anywhere in the medical literature that's more highly correlated with this than having a high VO2 max. VO2 max is a measure of your peak cardiorespiratory fitness. But the second most highly correlated metric of length of life is a composite metric of strength and muscle mass. So in other words, why people always ask me, why is it so important? I think it's important because those things are remarkable integral functions. VO2 max isn't just
do you want to define integral? Oh yeah.
Yeah. So they basically tell you, they add up the work that has been done to that point. So you don't just have a VO2 max because you woke up one day and decided to do something positive. You have a high VO2 max because you've been training very hard for a long period of time, in many cases for years. Similarly, a person doesn't just wake up and have a lot of muscle mass or have a lot of great strength. Those things are the product of a lot of work. And I think that's why they are so potent. In fact, they are far more potent as predictors of a long life than all of the negative things you can imagine are predictors of a short life. So when you look at things like smoking, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, even the presence of cancer has a lesser impact on the shortness of your life than those other variables have on the length of your life.
Yeah, I've read that grip strength, for example, is a good marker of propensity for longevity, well, in everyone, but particularly in elderly people. And it isn't, as you pointed out, because grip strength per se is particularly important, but because grip strength happens to be a good marker for overall, what would you say, psychophysiological integrity.
100%. Yeah, it's grip strength is one of the most potent. So put it this way, if you compare the top decile to the bottom decile in grip strength, it's a 70% difference in incidence and death from dementia, all-cause dementia, not just Alzheimer's, every form of dementia.
When I was in my mid-20s, when I was 21, 22, I weighed about 130 pounds, 135 pounds. I was 6'1", and so very, very thin. And I spent about 4 years intensely weightlifting. and packed on about 35 pounds of muscle. I had to eat like a mad dog for about 3 years to do that. But one of the things I noticed that was really cool was that I also got to be a lot more coordinated. I was using free weights, you know, because free weights help exercise all the little muscles and tendons, but it also seemed to be unbelievably useful for facilitating nerve myelinization. And I think now that was probably a good marker. That increase in coordination was probably a good marker for improved neurological function. And so
yeah, and as you age, it doesn't get a lot of attention, but sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass, the wasting away that occurs with aging, and again, this begins rather subtly. We lose, you know, what are called type 2 muscle fibers first. That's the hallmark of aging. So the type of muscle fiber that's responsible for explosive power is the first one that begins to atrophy when we age. Even at my age, I'm 50, I'm already experiencing that to a great extent. I don't have a fraction of the explosive power I had at 25. Once you lose explosive strength, you start to lose overall strength. And once you lose that, you're going to start to lose muscle size is the very last thing. So by the time a person is 75, the decline in muscle size, which is already preceding strength, is significant. Now, we can do a lot to prevent this, and I think that that's what's being captured by these statistics. The people who are able to delay that loss of strength and muscle mass are the ones that are going to live the longest on average.
Yeah, so on the weightlifting front, we talked a little bit about, you know, what you could do simply to start working out on the cardiovascular front. And brisk walking is the simplest and most straightforwardly implementable strategy on that front.
I would add one thing to that, Jordan, which is once a person reaches a certain level of fitness, the brisk walk may not be sufficient enough to produce enough cardiovascular stress. Depends where you live, but if you live in an area where you've got a lot of hills, that might not be the case. But for most people, you know, there's a limit in human gait to how fast you can walk, and for most people, it's about 3.5 to maybe up to 4 miles per hour. And again, at a certain point, that's not going to be fast enough. So what we can do for that individual, rather than have them transition to running, I like to put weight on their back, called rucking. So you carry a military type of backpack with plates of weight in the back, and now you, without putting additional stress on the knees, put additional stress on the cardiorespiratory system. So just throw that out there as additional ways to get this done.
Yeah, well, okay. As I said, in my 20s, I worked out with free weights, and I have a set of adjustable free weights now. But what I found very straightforward and actually implementable is to use I use about 20-25 pound weights depending on how often I'm doing it, and I run through a set of exercises through my whole body, you know, starting with my calves and moving upward. And I can do a whole workout routine, about 2 sets of 15 exercises in about 20 minutes. And so for everyone listening, it's also very simple to use to start weightlifting, because all you need is a couple of dumbbells. Size is going to depend on, you know, your size and your strength. But you can do an awful lot with 2 dumbbells. You can exercise your body in all sorts of ways. So that combined with walking, and you added another twist to that, that's not a bad initiation. Anything to add on the weightlifting front?
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would say, and I think about this stuff all the time, so I have a very elaborate gym. I do, you know, every sort of exercise you can imagine. But sometimes I like thinking and debating with people, like, what's the single most important exercise you could do if you could only do one? And for the lower body, I think step-ups would be, so if you had just 2 dumbbells and a box, you can do anything, right? Because you're going to do forward step up, backward step up, side step up. You can go heavy, you can go light. You focus on the concentric phase, which is the phase of getting up. Concentric is the phase of a muscle when it's getting shorter, but then you really get to focus on how slowly you can step down. So I'm doing box step ups at least twice a week. I do a count of 1 up, 3 down. So taking 3 full seconds on that one leg to descend. And that's training what we think of as the brakes. So when we age, this is a particular form of strength that deteriorates, which is eccentric strength, the strength that a muscle exhibits while it is getting longer. This is why so many old people fall. And the mortality of a fall when you are above the age of 65 is staggering. So depending on the series you look at, 15 to 30% of people over the age of 65 who fall and break a hip will be dead within a year of that fall. Of those who survive, 50% of them will experience a reduction in class of mobility. So, meaning people who walked normally will walk with a cane, people who walk with a cane will walk with a walker, people who walk with a walker will be wheelchair bound. This is a profound change in quality of life, and a lot of it has to do with a loss of this type of strength. If you think about it, people are much more likely to hurt themselves stepping off a curb when they get old than stepping onto a curb. It's these loss of breaks. So yeah, a set of dumbbells, which you can carry around, because that's really a very important piece of upper body strength, is being able to carry something. That's where that grip strength is coming from. And being able to do step ups, step downs, squats, all sorts of things. Yeah, you don't want to let perfect be the enemy of good when it comes to initiating this type of thing.
How high does the box work? Can you use steps?
Yeah. So I think a box is superior. What you want to be able to do is work up to a height such that when the foot is on the box, the front leg is on the box, the thigh is parallel to the ground. So for most people, that's 16 inches, maybe 18 inches. A very tall person might be 20 inches. I recommend people start at a 12-inch step until they, sort of, and you start with your body weight. Let's be clear. I mean, for many people, just doing a proper step up and step down with body weight at 12 inches is right. And actually, in the book, it was becoming so difficult to write about this in detail that I did. There's a whole section where I write about how to do this, but in the end, we created a thing on our website where I just have a bunch of videos where I illustrate these things. So in the book, it directs people to where to go to just see, I think, 8 or 9 videos of the most important exercises that I think people should be able to do.
Well, we should put that in the video description, so we'll have to remember to do that, yeah. All right, let's segue, if you don't mind, to nutrition and diet, and we can talk about obesity, diabetes, and inflammation on that front. I was interested in your comments on diabetes. So my understanding, and this is entangled with the problem of obesity, my understanding is that when physicians test for blood sugar, they age adjust the norms. And that strikes me as, let's say, peculiar, because it seems self-evident that if you have normal levels of blood sugar at 40, but that would make you diabetic or pre-diabetic at 20, then you're actually diabetic or pre-diabetic. And what that implies is that the rate of diabetes, which is already ridiculously and preposterously, devastatingly high, is actually much higher than we think. So correct me if I'm wrong, or elaborate on that if you would, if you think I'm onto something there.
So we don't do that. I can't speak to what any other physician does, but in our practice, we hold everybody to the same standard. I think we will acknowledge on one metric, because we use a standardized dose of glucose when we do what's called an oral glucose tolerance test. We will give women a little bit more latitude because they don't have as much muscle mass. So there's a particular test that we do where we give people 75 grams of glucose, and we time at 30, 60, 90, and 120 minutes what their glucose and insulin level is. And in that window of time, what you are testing is how efficiently do their muscles take up glucose. That's called glucose disposal. So you're measuring insulin sensitivity and glucose disposal. And in that window of time, that's the only place you can put the excess glucose. And because women have less muscle than men, we will tolerate a slightly higher glucose response, but we want the same insulin response. So it's a very subtle difference. But no, we don't age adjust for anybody. We want a 60-year-old to be as effective at this as a 30-year-old.
So can you outline for people what happens during normal Western aging, let's say, on insulin and glucose metabolism front, and what that implies for age-related degenerative diseases?
It's a very interesting thing, and we're not entirely clear why, but there is an unmistakable decline in insulin sensitivity as a person ages. Now, it doesn't mean that you're destined to have insulin resistance or fatty liver disease or type 2 diabetes when you age, but what it generally means is, on average, a person needs to be more diligent as they age. And I've heard lots of theories offered for this, and my guess is they all play a role. There's clearly a reduction in testosterone as we age. Testosterone is a very pro-metabolic health hormone, right? So testosterone promotes lipolysis of fat by muscle. It promotes insulin sensitivity. In fact, there was a clinical trial about 1.5 years ago that looked at men without type 2 diabetes, but who were pre-diabetic, on and off testosterone replacement therapy, and you showed a significant reduction in the progression to type 2 diabetes in men on testosterone. So clearly the decline of testosterone is playing a role in both men and women, by the way. We also see less expression or less activity of an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, LPL, where it shifts more of its activity from muscle to fat. This is, again, an enzyme that is responsible for the breakdown of fat. There are also other things, as you pointed out, such as inflammation, that increases with aging. We also tend to be less active as we age. And one of the most important things to preserve insulin sensitivity is activity. So there's a really famous researcher at Yale named Jerry Shulman, who's one of the world's authorities on the etiology of insulin resistance. And when he does clinical trials, when he does experiments on human subjects at Yale, and he wants to study insulin resistance, the one criteria he must have is that the subjects can't be physically active. So, in other words, for him to figure out what insulin resistance looks like, even in a 20-year-old, he has to ensure that they are not exercising at all. So it's some combination of these things and probably some other things that are explaining why all of us have to work harder as we age to avoid this phenotype.
So maybe you could define insulin resistance, describe its relationship to elevated blood sugar or blood sugar in general, and then discuss the relationship between the elevated blood sugar, insulin resistance, and aging as such.
So think of the muscle maybe as a balloon. And the balloon is the only place where you can put air. In this analogy, air is the glucose. So there are some balloons that are very easy to blow up. And you can put the glucose into the muscle cell, you can put the air into the balloon quite easily. You don't have to blow very hard. But imagine a balloon that's very, very difficult to put air into. And at some point you can get air into it, but you have to blow much harder. So how hard you have to blow is the amount of insulin you need to put the glucose into the muscle. At some point you will not be able to do that. You can't blow hard enough. So again, just thinking about this in terms of physiology, glucose is a molecule that needs to be regulated very carefully in our bodies. Too much and too little is catastrophic. And so the body does a great job of trying to take excess glucose out of the circulation and put it into muscle cells. By the way, just to put this in context, Jordan, a healthy person has about 1 teaspoon of glucose floating around all of their circulation at any moment in time. A person with frank,
1 teaspoon.
1 teaspoon. A person with frank diabetes has 2 teaspoons. That's the difference between healthy and nearly dying, right? It's profound.
And how many teaspoons of sugar are in a bottle of Coke? It's 30, I think, or 35.
About 8. About 8 teaspoons in a small.
I guess I was thinking of a big.
Yeah,
I was thinking
in a big 2 liter. In a big 2 liter it would probably be about that. Yeah.
Right.
So our body is amazing at doing this, but it's a very delicate dance between how much insulin do you need to make it happen. And the canary in the coal mine of insulin resistance is after a person is challenged with glucose, even if their glucose levels normalize, they needed supranormal levels of insulin to do it. That's the initial blowing too hard on the balloon.
So when you develop insulin resistance and that progresses to diabetes, you literally can't produce enough insulin to get sugar into the muscles.
That's correct. Eventually, you cannot make enough insulin. And this is complicated by another factor, which ties in